A couple of years ago, I found myself in a situation that still gives me chills when I think about it. I was living alone in a small house just outside Seattle, Washington. It was a quiet neighborhood in Bellevue, one of those places where everyone knows each other by name and nothing much ever happens. My little house was tucked away on a cul-de-sac, surrounded by tall pine trees that made it feel secluded and peaceful. I had moved there about 6 months earlier for a new job in the tech industry. The transition from my hometown in the Midwest to the Pacific Northwest had been exciting, but also a bit overwhelming. I was still getting used to the constant drizzle and the laid-back Seattle vibe. My job kept me busy, and I hadn't made many friends yet, so I spent a lot of my free time at home. It was a Saturday afternoon in early fall. The weather was typical for Seattle, overcast with a light mist hanging in the air. I had decided to spend the day indoors, catching up on a new TV series that everyone at work had been raving about. I remember feeling cozy and content, wrapped up in a blanket on my couch with a mug of hot cocoa beside me. I was about 4 episodes deep into my binge-watching session when the doorbell rang. The sound startled me. I wasn't expecting anyone, and in this neighborhood, people didn't usually drop by unannounced. I paused my show and got up, a bit annoyed at the interruption. As I approached the door, I could see a figure through the frosted glass panel. It looked like someone in a uniform. My first thought was that it might be a package delivery, even though I couldn't remember ordering anything recently. Still, with all the online shopping I did, it wasn't uncommon for me to forget about an order. I opened the door, and sure enough, there was a man standing there in what looked like a delivery uniform. He was holding a medium-sized box and had a clipboard tucked under his arm. He greeted me with a smile, but something about it didn't quite reach his eyes. The man asked if I could sign for the package. I hesitated for a moment, trying to recall if I was expecting any deliveries. That's when I started noticing things that seemed off. His uniform looked a bit too worn, almost like a costume rather than a real delivery outfit. The package he was holding had no label, no barcodes, nothing to indicate where it had come from or who it was for. A sense of unease began to creep over me. I asked him who the package was for, thinking maybe it was meant for one of my neighbors. His smile faltered for a split second before he said it was addressed to this house. Something in his tone made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Before I could react or close the door, the man suddenly pushed forward. The force of it caught me off guard, and I stumbled backward into my entryway. The delivery man followed, quickly closing the door behind him. In an instant, the situation had changed from strange to terrifying. The man's demeanor completely transformed. The fake friendly smile was gone, replaced by a hard, determined look. He demanded money, his voice low and threatening. I felt my heart racing, my mind struggling to process what was happening. This quiet Saturday afternoon had turned into a nightmare in a matter of seconds. I tried to stay calm, even as panic threatened to overwhelm me. I told him I didn't have any cash in the house, which was true. Like most people these days, I rarely carried cash and did most of my transactions electronically. The man didn't seem to believe me at first, insisting that I must have some money hidden away. As he became more agitated, I frantically tried to think of a way out of this situation. That's when an idea struck me. I told him that while I didn't have cash, I could transfer money to him electronically if he let me get my phone from the living room. It was a risky move, but I hoped it might buy me some time and give me access to my phone. To my relief, he agreed, but warned me not to try anything stupid. He followed closely behind me as I walked to the living room, his presence looming over me like a shadow. I could feel my hands shaking as I picked up my phone from the coffee table. I pretended to fumble with the banking app, all the while discreetly sending a text to my friend Lisa, who lived a few blocks away. The message was brief but clear. Call 911. Intruder in my house. I hit send and prayed that Lisa would see the message quickly. The man was growing impatient, demanding to know what was taking so long. I made up an excuse about the app being slow, trying to buy more time. Every second felt like an eternity as I hoped for Lisa to get my message and for help to arrive. Just as the man's patience was wearing thin, I heard the blessed sound of sirens in the distance. The man froze for a moment, his eyes widening in realization. Then, without warning, he bolted towards the back door. I heard it slam as he ran out into my backyard. I rushed to lock the door behind him, my hands shaking so badly I could barely turn the deadbolt. Then I ran to the front door, throwing it open just as 2 police cars pulled up in front of my house. I must have looked a sight, pale, shaking, and on the verge of tears. The officers quickly assessed the situation, asking me if I was hurt, and if the intruder was still in the house. I managed to tell them that he had run out the back. They immediately split up, one team staying with me while the others went to search the area. As I sat on my porch, giving my statement to one of the officers, I heard a commotion from the backyard. Moments later, I saw the other officers leading the man out in handcuffs. They had caught him trying to climb over my neighbor's fence. The relief I felt in that moment was indescribable. The next few hours were a blur of police statements, crime scene investigators taking photos and dusting for fingerprints, and concerned neighbors gathering to see what all the commotion was about. Lisa arrived at some point, enveloping me in a tight hug and repeatedly asking if I was okay. As the adrenaline wore off, the reality of what had happened began to sink in. The police informed me that the man they had arrested was wanted for a string of similar crimes in the area. He had been targeting people by posing as a delivery person, taking advantage of people's trust and routine to gain entry into their homes. I learned that I had been lucky in many ways. Some of his previous victims had been hurt when they resisted, and others had lost valuable possessions. My quick thinking and texting Lisa and stalling for time had likely prevented a worse outcome. The days that followed were difficult. I found myself jumping at every sound, constantly checking and rechecking that my doors and windows were locked. Sleep became elusive, as every creak of the house settling would jolt me awake, convinced that someone was trying to break in again. I still live in the same house. At first, I thought about moving, worried that I'd never feel safe there again. But over time, I reclaimed my space. I refused to let one terrible incident define my life, or drive me from a home and community I've grown to love. Now, when I hear my doorbell ring, I still feel a momentary flutter of anxiety. But I've learned to manage it, to approach each day with caution, but not fear. Last summer, I found myself in a situation that I never thought I'd experience. It was a typical Friday night in Dallas, Texas, and I was settling in for a quiet evening at home. My apartment was in a decent area of the city, not too far from downtown. It wasn't the fanciest place, but it was cozy and felt like home. I'd been living there for about a year with my roommate Sarah, and we'd never had any issues before. Sarah had left earlier that day for a weekend trip to visit her family in Houston. I remember waving goodbye as she drove off, thinking about how I'd have the place to myself for a couple of days. I had plans to catch up on some Netflix shows and maybe order in some food from my favorite Thai place down the street. As the evening wore on, I found myself engrossed in a new crime drama series. The irony of what was about to happen didn't escape me later. I must have watched about 4 episodes back to back, completely losing track of time. Before I knew it, it was nearing midnight. I decided to call it a night, headed to the bathroom to get ready for bed. As I was brushing my teeth, I heard a noise that made me pause. It sounded like it came from outside the apartment, maybe in the hallway. I didn't think much of it at first. After all, people come and go at all hours in an apartment building. But then I heard it again. This time it was unmistakable. Footsteps. They were slow and deliberate, like someone was trying to be quiet but not quite succeeding. My heart started to race a little. I told myself it was probably just a neighbor coming home late, but something felt off. I finished up in the bathroom and walked quietly to my bedroom, straining my ears to hear any more sounds. The footsteps had stopped, but now I could hear a faint rustling sound coming from the living room. That's when the reality of the situation hit me. Someone was in our apartment. My mind started racing. Had I forgotten to lock the door when Sarah left? No, I was sure I had checked it. Maybe Sarah had come back early and forgotten her key. But she would have called or texted me if that were the case. I grabbed my phone from the nightstand, my hands shaking slightly. I considered calling Sarah, but I didn't want to make any noise if there really was an intruder in the apartment. Instead, I opened my text messages and sent a quick SOS to my friend Mike, who lived in the building next door. I told him I thought someone was in my apartment and asked him to call the police if he didn't hear back from me in the next 5 minutes. The footsteps started again, this time moving towards the bedrooms. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. I looked around frantically, trying to decide what to do. Hide? Try to escape? Confront the intruder? None of the options seemed good. In the end, I decided to hide. I slipped into my closet as quietly as I could, pushing aside hangers and shoeboxes to make space for myself. I pulled the door almost closed, leaving just a tiny crack so I could see out into the room. From my hiding spot, I could hear the intruder more clearly now. The footsteps were definitely too heavy to be Sarah's. I heard drawers opening and closing, the sound of things being moved around. My mind raced with possibilities. Was it a burglar? Someone with more sinister intentions? I dialed 911 on my phone, my finger hovering over the call button. I was afraid to make the call, worried that the intruder might hear me talking. But as the sounds of ransacking got louder, I knew I had to do something. I pressed the call button and held the phone to my ear, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure the intruder would hear it. When the operator answered, I whispered as quietly as I could, explaining the situation. The operator was calm and reassuring, telling me that help was on the way and to stay hidden. As I was on the phone, I heard my bedroom door open. I held my breath, trying to make myself as small and quiet as possible in the closet. Through the crack in the door, I could see a shadow moving around my room. The intruder was muttering to himself, sounding frustrated. I couldn't make out what he was saying, but the tone was angry. I watched in horror as he rifled through my dresser drawers, tossing clothes and belongings onto the floor. He moved to my desk next, opening drawers, shuffling through papers. I silently thanked my past self for putting my laptop in my bag, which was with me in the closet. The minutes felt like hours as I sat there, barely breathing, watching this stranger go through my things. I kept the line open with the 911 operator, who periodically whispered reassurances that help was coming. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, I heard sirens in the distance. The intruder heard them too. He suddenly stopped what he was doing and stood still for a moment. Then, without warning, he bolted out of the room. I heard his heavy footsteps running through the apartment and then the sound of the front door slamming shut. I stayed in the closet, unsure if it was safe to come out. The operator on the phone told me to stay put until the police arrived. A few minutes later, I heard loud knocking at the front door and voices identifying themselves as police officers. Shaking, I emerged from the closet and made my way to the front door. I opened it to find 2 officers standing there, looking concerned. They quickly entered the apartment, checking each room to ensure the intruder was gone. Once they confirmed the apartment was clear, they sat me down to take my statement. I told them everything that had happened, my voice still trembling. They were kind and patient, assuring me that I had done the right thing by hiding and calling for help. As I looked around the apartment, I was shocked by the mess. Drawers were pulled out, contents spilled onto the floor. Couch cushions were overturned and items from shelves were scattered everywhere. It looked like a tornado had torn through the place. The officers explained that there had been a string of break-ins in the area over the past few weeks. They suspected it was the same person or group responsible. They took some photos of the apartment and dusted for fingerprints, but warned me that these types of cases can be hard to solve. After the police left, I called Sarah to let her know what had happened. She was horrified and immediately said she'd come back early from her trip. I also called Mike, who came over right away to help me clean up and offered to let me stay at his place for the night. As I gathered some clothes and essentials to take to Mike's, the reality of what had just happened began to sink in. I felt violated, knowing that a stranger had been in my space touching my things. The apartment that had felt like a safe haven just hours ago now felt tainted and unsafe. That night, staying at Mike's, I barely slept. Every little noise made me jump, and I kept replaying the events of the evening in my mind. What if I hadn't hidden in time? What if the intruder had found me? The what-ifs were endless and terrifying. The next day, Sarah returned, and we spent hours putting the apartment back in order. We also met with the building manager to discuss improving security. They promised to install better locks and a security camera in the hallway, but it felt like too little, too late. Over the next few weeks, I found it increasingly difficult to feel comfortable in the apartment. I'd wake up in the middle of the night. Sure, I'd heard a noise. During the day, I'd constantly check and recheck that the doors and windows were locked. The sense of security I'd once felt in my own home was completely shattered. Sarah was supportive, but I could tell she was struggling too. We both jumped at unexpected noises and were hyper-vigilant about security. We started looking for a new place to live, somewhere that felt safer. About a month after the break-in, we found a new apartment in a different part of Dallas. It was a bit more expensive, but it had better security features, including a doorman and security cameras throughout the building. Moving was a hassle, but as soon as we were settled in the new place, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. In the end, the police never caught the person who broke into our apartment. But I like to think that by calling for help and causing them to flee, I might have prevented them from targeting someone else. It's a small consolation, but it helps me find some meaning in an otherwise senseless act. A few years ago, I found myself in a situation that still sends shivers down my spine when I think about it. I had just moved to Chicago for a new job opportunity, excited about the change of scenery and the chance to live in a big city. After weeks of searching, I finally found a cozy studio apartment in the Lakeview neighborhood. It was small, but perfect for a single person like me, and I fell in love with it immediately. The apartment was on the 3rd floor of an older building with big windows that let in plenty of natural light. The hardwood floors creaked a bit, but I found it charming. The kitchen was tiny but functional, and the bathroom, while not luxurious, was clean and recently updated. It felt like a steal for the price, especially considering the location. I spent the first few weeks settling in, arranging my furniture and getting to know the neighborhood. I discovered a great little coffee shop just around the corner and a park nearby where I could go for runs. Everything seemed perfect, and I felt like I was finally starting to build a life for myself in Chicago. My job kept me busy during the day, and I often came home tired, but satisfied. I'd usually spend my evenings watching TV, reading, or video chatting with friends and family back home. It was a simple routine, but I was content. About a month into living there, I started noticing some odd things. At first, they were so small that I barely paid attention. I'd come home and feel like something was slightly off, but I couldn't put my finger on what it was. Maybe a book on my shelf was in a different position, or a cup I thought I'd left on the coffee table was in the sink. I brushed these occurrences off, telling myself I was just forgetful or too tired to remember exactly how I'd left things. After all, living alone in a new city was bound to be a bit disorienting, right? But as time went on, the incidents became more noticeable and harder to explain away. One evening, I came home to find my TV on. I stood in the doorway, keys still in hand, staring at the screen in confusion. I was certain I had turned it off before leaving for work that morning. I always did. I walked around the apartment, checking every corner, half expecting to find an intruder. But everything else seemed normal. I told myself I must have been in a rush that morning and forgotten to turn it off. Still, an uneasy feeling settled in my stomach. A few days later, I noticed that some of my clothes in the dresser were folded differently than how I usually did it. It was subtle, but I had a specific way of organizing my clothes, and these definitely weren't folded my way. I spent a good hour going through all my belongings, trying to see if anything was missing, but everything seemed to be there. I started paying more attention to these little discrepancies, keeping a mental note of how I left things when I went out. The incidents continued. Sometimes I'd find a window open that I was sure I'd closed. Other times, items on my desk would be rearranged slightly. I began to feel paranoid. Was I losing my mind? Was the stress of the new job and new city getting to me? I considered talking to my friends about it, but I was afraid they'd think I was crazy. Instead, I started leaving little traps for myself. A piece of tape on the door that would break if someone opened it, or a hair placed across a drawer. One day, about 2 months after moving in, I came home to find the hair on my bedroom drawer disturbed. My heart raced as I realized this wasn't just my imagination. Someone had been in my apartment while I was gone. I immediately called the building manager, explaining my concerns. He seemed skeptical at first, suggesting that maybe the cleaning staff had entered by mistake. But I knew that couldn't be the case. I didn't pay for cleaning services, and no one should have been entering my apartment without my knowledge. The manager agreed to change the locks on my door, which provided some temporary relief. But the feeling of violation lingered. I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder, even in my own home. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, convinced I heard footsteps or breathing. Despite the new locks, the strange occurrences continued. I started taking photos of my apartment before leaving each day, just to have proof that things were being moved. I became obsessed with documenting every little change. About a week after the locks were changed, I made a terrifying discovery. I was cleaning the bathroom, standing on the toilet to reach the top shelf of the medicine cabinet, when something caught my eye. There, hidden in the smoke detector on the ceiling, was a tiny camera lens. My blood ran cold. I stared at it for what felt like hours, unable to process what I was seeing. When I finally snapped out of my shock, I grabbed my phone and took several photos of the camera, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the phone steady. In a daze, I started searching the rest of the apartment. I found another camera hidden in a vent in the living room, and a third one disguised as a screw in my bedside lamp. The realization that someone had been watching me, invading my privacy in the most intimate way possible, made me physically ill. I grabbed my essentials and ran out of the apartment, not even bothering to lock the door behind me. I went straight to the police station, where I filed a report and showed them the photos I'd taken. The officers were concerned and sympathetic, assuring me they would investigate. I couldn't bear the thought of going back to the apartment, so I called my friend Sarah, who lived in the suburbs. Through tears, I explained what had happened, and she immediately offered to let me stay with her. The next few days were a blur of police interviews, visits back to the apartment with investigators, and sleepless nights at Sarah's place. The police found a total of 5 hidden cameras in my apartment. They also discovered that the cameras were wireless and connected to the building's Wi-Fi network, meaning whoever installed them could have been accessing the feed from anywhere. The building manager was horrified when he learned about the cameras. He swore he had no idea and promised to cooperate fully with the investigation. The police interviewed all the building staff and residents, but no one seemed to know anything. As the investigation continued, more disturbing details emerged. The cameras had been installed professionally, suggesting this wasn't just some random peeping Tom, but someone with technical knowledge and access to sophisticated equipment. The police forensics team worked to trace the signal from the cameras, hoping to find where the feed was being sent. Meanwhile, I was left to grapple with the knowledge that my privacy had been completely violated. How long had the cameras been there? Who had been watching me? The questions kept me up at night. I couldn't bring myself to go back to the apartment, even after the police had removed all the cameras and swept for any additional devices. The thought of sleeping in that bed, using that bathroom, living in those rooms where I had been secretly watched, made my skin crawl. Sarah was incredibly supportive, letting me stay with her as long as I needed. But I knew I couldn't impose on her forever. I started looking for a new place to live, this time with a paranoid attention to detail that I'd never had before. The investigation dragged on for weeks. The police followed several leads, but nothing seemed to pan out. They discovered that the cameras had been installed about a month before I moved in, suggesting that I might not have been the intended target, but rather just the unlucky tenant who ended up in that apartment. This realization brought a mix of relief and renewed fear. On one hand, it meant that whoever had installed the cameras probably wasn't targeting me specifically. On the other hand, it meant that this person had access to the building and apartments even when they were supposed to be empty. As I searched for a new place to live, I found myself scrutinizing every potential apartment with an intensity that probably seemed crazy to the realtors showing me around. I checked every vent, light fixture, and smoke detector. I asked about the Wi-Fi setup, the maintenance staff, the security measures. Finally, after nearly a month of searching, I found a place that felt safe. It was a newer building with much stricter security measures, including key fob access and 24/7 surveillance cameras in all common areas. The apartment itself was on a high floor, making it less accessible from the outside. I continued to reside in Chicago, in the same apartment I relocated to following the incident. A couple of years ago, I found myself in a situation that still makes my skin crawl when I think about it. I was living in a small apartment in Astoria, Queens, New York City. It was a cozy little place, nothing fancy, but it was my first solo apartment, and I was proud of it. The building was an older walk-up, 5 stories tall, with about 4 apartments on each floor. I was on the 3rd floor, apartment 3B. I had moved to New York about a year earlier for a job in advertising. The city was everything I had hoped for. Exciting, fast-paced, and full of opportunities. But it was also exhausting, especially for a small-town girl like me. I was still getting used to the constant noise, the crowds, and the general hustle and bustle of city life. It was a Friday night in late October. The weather had just started to turn chilly, and there was a crisp autumn feel in the air. I remember looking forward to this particular evening all week. Work had been incredibly hectic, with back-to-back client meetings and looming deadlines. All I wanted was a quiet night in, maybe order some takeout, watch a movie, and just relax. I got home around 7 p.m., later than usual because I had stopped at the grocery store to pick up some essentials. As I climbed the stairs to my apartment, the elevator was perpetually out of order. I could hear the usual sounds of my neighbors. Kids running around, a TV blaring, someone practicing what sounded like the violin rather poorly. It was all part of the soundtrack of my life in New York, and despite its chaotic nature, it had become oddly comforting. Once inside my apartment, I changed into my comfiest sweatpants and an old college t-shirt. I heated up some leftover pasta, poured myself a glass of wine, and settled on the couch with my laptop to browse through Netflix. I finally decided on a rom-com I'd been meaning to watch for ages. As the movie played, I found myself finally unwinding from the stress of the week. The wine was helping too, I have to admit. I was just starting to feel drowsy when there was a knock on my door. I glanced at the clock on my phone. It was just after 10 p.m. At first I thought maybe I had imagined it. Who would be knocking on my door at this hour? But then it came again, a bit louder this time. I paused the movie and got up, a little annoyed at the interruption of my peaceful evening. I approached the door cautiously. Living in New York, you quickly learn to be wary of unexpected visitors, especially at night. I looked through the peephole and saw a man standing there. He was wearing dark blue overalls and holding a toolbox. My first thought was that he looked like a plumber or maintenance worker. The man knocked again, and this time he called out, saying he was from building management. He mentioned something about a leak reported in the apartment below mine and said he needed to check my bathroom plumbing. I hesitated. It seemed odd for maintenance to show up so late, but then again, this was New York. I'd learned that things often operated on their own strange schedule here. And if there really was a leak, I didn't want to be responsible for any damage to my downstairs neighbor's apartment. Against my better judgment, I decided to let him in. I unlocked the door and opened it, keeping the chain on. The man smiled and held up an ID badge, but it was too dark in the hallway for me to read it properly. He repeated his story about the leak and asked if he could come in to check the bathroom. I unhooked the chain and let him enter. As he walked past me, I caught a whiff of cigarette smoke and something else I couldn't quite place. He went straight to the bathroom, his toolbox clanking as he walked. I followed him part way, hovering near the bathroom door as he entered. He turned on the faucet and bent down to look under the sink. I stood there awkwardly, not sure if I should stay and watch or go back to the living room. After a few minutes of him fiddling around, I started to feel uneasy. Something just didn't feel right. I decided to go back to the living room to grab my phone, just in case. As I turned away from the bathroom, I heard a noise that didn't sound like plumbing work. It was more like drawers opening and closing. My heart started racing. I quickly grabbed my phone from the coffee table and turned back towards the bathroom. But when I got there, the so-called plumber wasn't there. Panic rising in my throat, I looked around and realized the noise was coming from my bedroom. I rushed to the bedroom door and pushed it open. There he was, the man in overalls, rifling through my dresser drawers. He had pulled out my jewelry box and was shoving things into his pockets. For a moment, I stood there frozen in shock. This couldn't be happening. Not in my safe little apartment, not on my quiet Friday night in. But it was happening. and I knew I had to act fast. I shouted at him, demanding to know what he was doing and telling him to get out of my apartment immediately. He spun around, clearly startled to see me there. For a split second, I saw panic in his eyes, quickly replaced by a calculated calmness that was even more terrifying. He tried to play it cool, saying he was looking for the source of the leak. But his hand was still in my jewelry box, and I could see the bulge in his pocket where he had stashed my things. I wasn't buying it for a second. I held up my phone, my hand shaking, and told him I was calling the police. That seemed to snap him into action. He grabbed his toolbox and pushed past me, nearly knocking me over in his haste to get out of the bedroom. I followed him, keeping my distance but making sure he was leaving. He was muttering under his breath, but I couldn't make out what he was saying. As he reached the front door, he turned back towards me. For a terrifying moment, I thought he might try to attack me or force his way back in. But instead, he just gave me a cold, hard stare before yanking the door open and disappearing into the hallway. As soon as the door slammed shut behind him, I locked it. Deadbolt, chain, everything. Then I sank to the floor, my back against the door, heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. I sat there for what felt like hours, but was probably only a few minutes, trying to process what had just happened. When I finally managed to pull myself together, I called the police. They arrived quickly. 2 officers who listened to my story with serious expressions. They took a statement and looked around my apartment, but of course, the man was long gone. After the police left, I called the building superintendent. He was groggy and confused. It was nearly midnight by this point, but he confirmed what I had begun to suspect. No plumber or maintenance worker had been scheduled to come to my apartment. The whole thing had been a ruse to get inside. I spent the rest of the night wide awake, jumping at every little sound. I must have checked the locks 100 times. When the sun finally came up, I felt a small measure of relief, but I knew I wouldn't feel truly safe in that apartment again. Over the next few days, I learned more about what had happened. The police investigation revealed that there had been a string of similar incidents in the neighborhood. A man matching the description I gave had been posing as a maintenance worker to gain entry to apartments, usually targeting women living alone. I was lucky, in a way. Many of his other victims had lost valuable jewelry and electronics. Some had even been assaulted. My quick action in confronting him had likely prevented a worse outcome. But even knowing I had been relatively fortunate didn't erase the fear and violation I felt. My apartment, which had once been my safe haven, now felt tainted. I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder, even in broad daylight. I couldn't sleep without checking and rechecking the locks multiple times. I decided to take action to regain some sense of control. I installed additional locks on my door and a security camera in the hallway outside my apartment. I signed up for self-defense classes and started carrying pepper spray. I also got to know my neighbors better, figuring that a strong community was an additional layer of protection. The building management, shaken by the incident, implemented new security measures. They installed better lighting in the hallways and stairwells, and implemented a system where all maintenance requests had to be confirmed with tenants in advance, with workers required to show proper ID. Despite these changes, I still felt uneasy in the apartment. Every knock on the door made my heart race. Every time I came home, I half expected to find someone hiding inside. I started spending more time out of the apartment, staying late at work or hanging out at friends' places. About a month after the incident, the police called with an update. They had arrested a man they believed was responsible for the string of break-ins, including the one at my apartment. They asked if I would be willing to look at a photo lineup to see if I could identify him. I agreed, even though the thought of seeing his face again made my stomach churn. When I went to the police station, they showed me a series of photos. My hands were shaking as I looked at them, but I knew immediately when I saw him. Those cold eyes were unmistakable. The detective told me that my identification, along with evidence from other victims, would likely be enough to put him away for a long time. It was a small comfort, knowing he wouldn't be able to do this to anyone else, at least for a while. But even with him behind bars, I couldn't shake the feeling of vulnerability that had taken root that night. I realized that I needed a fresh start, somewhere I could feel safe again. After much deliberation, I decided to move. I found a new apartment in a different neighborhood, a more modern building with better security. It was a bit more expensive, but the peace of mind was worth every penny. I also changed jobs, finding a position at a different agency that was closer to my new place. A few years back, I was living in this old duplex in Somerville, just outside of Boston. It was one of those typical New England houses, probably built in the early 1900s with creaky floors and drafty windows. The rent was decent, especially for the area, and I was pretty happy with my little spot. The only downside was that I had to share the basement with the other tenant for laundry and storage. Now, I'm not usually the type to get spooked easily, but there was something about that basement that always gave me the creeps. Maybe it was the dim lighting or the musty smell, or maybe it was just my imagination running wild. Whatever it was, I always tried to do my laundry during the day when there was still some natural light seeping through the tiny windows. But life doesn't always work out the way we want it to, right? This particular day had been a nightmare at work. I'm a software developer, and we were rushing to meet a deadline for a big client. By the time I finally managed to leave the office, it was already dark outside. I grabbed a quick bite at this little pizza joint near Davis Square, scarfing down a slice of pepperoni while walking to the T station. As I rode the red line back to Porter Square, I couldn't help but feel the exhaustion settling in. My eyes were burning from staring at screens all day, and my back was aching from hunching over my desk. All I wanted was to crash on my couch and binge-watch some mindless TV show. But as I walked into my apartment, the first thing that hit me was the smell. I'd completely forgotten about the gym clothes I'd left in my bag for the past couple of days. Gross. There was no way I could leave them like that until the weekend. So against my better judgment, I decided to do a load of laundry. I gathered up all my dirty clothes, grabbed my detergent and fabric softener, and headed down to the basement. It was around 11 p.m. by this point, and the house was eerily quiet. As I descended the stairs, each step seemed to creak louder than the last, like the house was protesting my late-night laundry plans. When I reached the bottom of the stairs, I flicked on the light switch. The single bare bulb in the center of the room flickered to life, casting long shadows across the concrete floor. The basement was a mess of cardboard boxes, old furniture, and forgotten junk. My landlord had promised to clear it out months ago, but like most of his promises, it never happened. I made my way over to the ancient washing machine, trying not to trip over the clutter. As I started sorting my clothes, I couldn't shake this uneasy feeling. You know when you're alone, but you don't feel alone? It was like that. I tried to rationalize it, telling myself it was just the stress from work and lack of sleep, making me paranoid. I had just finished loading the washer and was about to pour in the detergent when I heard it. A soft shuffling sound like something moving against cardboard. I froze, my hand still holding the detergent bottle mid-pour. For a moment, I thought maybe it was just the pipes or the old house settling. But then I heard it again, closer this time. My heart started racing, and I could feel the adrenaline coursing through my veins. I slowly turned around, my eyes scanning the dimly lit room. The flickering light wasn't helping, creating moving shadows that played tricks on my eyes. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, just my imagination getting the better of me. But then I saw it. In the far corner of the basement, partially hidden behind a stack of boxes, was a dark shape. At first I thought it might be a garbage bag or some old clothes. But as I stared, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, the shape moved. I felt like I was in one of those horror movies where the character does exactly what you're screaming at them not to do. I knew I should run, but my feet felt glued to the floor. My mind was racing, trying to come up with a rational explanation for what I was seeing. That's when the shape stood up, and I realized with horror that it was a person. A man, to be exact. He was tall and thin, with long, matted hair and a scraggly beard. His clothes were filthy and torn, hanging off his frame like rags. But what really got me were his eyes. Even in the dim light, I could see them clearly, wide and wild, staring right at me. For what felt like an eternity, we just stood there, locked in a staring contest. My brain was screaming at me to move, to run, to do something, but my body wouldn't respond. It was like one of those nightmares where you're trying to run, but your legs won't work. Finally, some primal instinct kicked in, and I bolted. I don't even remember running up the stairs. One moment I was in the basement, and the next I was slamming my apartment door behind me, fumbling with the lock with shaking hands. Once I was sure the door was locked, I collapsed against it, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. My mind was racing, trying to process what had just happened. Who was that man? How long had he been down there? Was he still there? With trembling hands, I pulled out my phone and dialed 911. The dispatcher's calm voice was a stark contrast to my panicked rambling as I tried to explain the situation. She assured me that officers were on their way and advised me to stay in my apartment with the doors locked. Those next few minutes felt like hours. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind outside made me jump. I kept imagining the man somehow getting into my apartment, even though logically I knew all the doors and windows were locked. When I finally heard the police sirens, it was like a weight lifted off my chest. I went to the window and saw 2 police cruisers pulling up outside. 4 officers got out, and I buzzed them into the building. After checking that I was okay, 2 of the officers went down to the basement while the other 2 stayed with me. They asked me to describe what I'd seen, and I did my best to recount the events, though it all felt like a blur. A few minutes later, we heard voices from downstairs, and then the 2 officers reappeared, escorting the man I'd seen. Seeing him in the brighter light of the hallway, he looked even more disheveled than I'd first thought. He wasn't resisting or causing any trouble. He just looked lost. One of the officers explained that the man was homeless and had been using our basement as a place to sleep. Apparently, he'd found a way to jimmy open one of the small basement windows and had been sneaking in and out for who knows how long. I felt a mix of emotions. On one hand, I was relieved that he wasn't some violent criminal. On the other hand, the idea that someone had been living in our basement without anyone knowing was deeply unsettling. How many nights had I slept soundly while a stranger was just a floor below me? The police took the man into custody, not to arrest him, but to connect him with social services. They assured me they'd do a thorough check of the basement and secure the windows. They also suggested I talk to my landlord about improving the security of the building. After the police left, I sat on my couch, still trying to process everything that had happened. The adrenaline was wearing off, leaving me feeling drained, jittery at the same time. There was no way I was going back down to the basement that night, so my laundry would have to wait. I called my landlord, waking him up to tell him what had happened. He seemed more annoyed about being woken up than concerned about the security breach. He grudgingly agreed to come by in the morning to check things out. Sleep was out of the question, so I spent the rest of the night binge-watching a sitcom on Netflix, trying to distract myself from replaying the events in my head. Every time I started to doze off, I'd jerk awake, imagining I heard noises from downstairs. The next morning, my landlord showed up, looking hungover and irritable. He half-heartedly checked the basement windows, hammering a few extra nails into the frames as if that would solve the problem. He brushed off my concerns, saying it was a one-time thing and not to worry about it. I knew I was being irrational. The man was gone. The police had checked everything, and logically, I knew I was safe. But logic doesn't always win against fear. Every time I came home late, I'd find myself scanning the street, looking for any sign of the man or anyone else who might be lurking around. I tried to talk to my friends about it, but most of them just told me to get over it. They didn't understand why I was still so shaken up. It was just a homeless guy, they'd say. He didn't hurt you or anything. But they hadn't been there. They hadn't seen those eyes staring at them in the dim basement light. In the end, I decided to move. I found a small studio apartment in Cambridge, closer to work and in a more modern building with better security. It was more expensive, but I figured my peace of mind was worth the extra rent. About 3 years ago, I found myself in a situation that still gives me chills when I think about it. It was summer in Los Angeles, and I had agreed to house sit for my friend Sarah while she and her family went on a 2-week vacation to Europe. Sarah lived in a beautiful neighborhood in Sherman Oaks, a quiet, upscale area in the San Fernando Valley. The house was in a cul-de-sac surrounded by well-manicured lawns and towering palm trees. I was excited about the opportunity. As a struggling writer living in a tiny studio apartment in Koreatown, the chance to spend 2 weeks in a spacious house with a pool seemed like a dream come true. I imagined lazy days spent writing by the pool, evenings watching movies on their massive TV, and enjoying the peace and quiet of suburban life. The first few days were exactly as I had imagined. I settled into a routine, waking up early to write, taking breaks to swim in the pool, and enjoying the luxury of having so much space to myself. The neighborhood was incredibly quiet, especially at night. The only sounds I'd hear after dark were the occasional car passing by or the distant bark of a neighbor's dog. It was on the 5th night that things took a turn. I had stayed up late, working on a screenplay I'd been struggling with. The words were finally flowing, and I didn't want to break my momentum. By the time I finally decided to call it a night, it was almost 2 a.m. I had just changed into my pajamas and was brushing my teeth when I heard it. A loud, insistent knocking on the front door. The sound echoed through the quiet house, making me jump. I froze, toothbrush still in my mouth, listening intently. Maybe I had imagined it? But then it came again, even louder this time. My heart started racing. Who could be knocking at this hour? My mind immediately went to Sarah and her family. Had something happened to them? Was this the police coming to deliver bad news? I quickly rinsed my mouth and crept down the stairs, my bare feet silent on the plush carpet. The knocking continued, growing more insistent with each passing second. As I reached the bottom of the stairs, I could see the front door at the end of the hallway. The porch light was off, but through the decorative glass panels on either side of the door, I could make out a dark shape. My first instinct was to open the door, but a nagging feeling in my gut held me back. Instead, I moved to the living room window, which gave a clear view of the front porch. Carefully, I peeked through a gap in the blinds. The porch was empty. A chill ran down my spine. I could still hear the knocking, but there was no one at the door. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. Was someone playing a prank? Was I so tired that I was imagining things? I moved back to the hallway, my heart pounding so loudly, I was sure whoever was out there could hear it. The knocking was even louder now, more aggressive. It no longer sounded like someone politely requesting entry. It was demanding, threatening. I called out, asking who was there. My voice sounded small and scared, even to my own ears. There was no response, just more knocking. Fear gripped me. This wasn't right. Something was very, very wrong. With shaking hands, I pulled my cell phone from my pocket and dialed 911. The dispatcher answered quickly, and I tried to explain the situation as calmly as I could. She assured me that officers were on their way and advised me to stay inside and not open the door. As I was talking to the dispatcher, the knocking suddenly stopped. The silence that followed was almost as terrifying as the knocking had been. I stood there in the hallway, phone pressed to my ear, straining to hear any sound from outside. Minutes passed, feeling like hours. I jumped at every little creak of the house settling, every rustle of leaves outside. The dispatcher stayed on the line with me, her calm voice a lifeline in the midst of my panic. Finally, I heard the sound of a car pulling up outside. The dispatcher confirmed it was the police and told me I could hang up. I watched through the window as two officers got out of their patrol car and approached the house, flashlights scanning the area. I opened the door, relief washing over me at the sight of the uniformed officers. They asked me to stay inside while they checked the perimeter of the house. I watched anxiously as their flashlight beams moved around the property. After what seemed like an eternity, they came back to the front door. They hadn't found anyone, nor any signs of attempted break-in. They asked me questions about what I'd heard and seen, taking notes and exchanging glances that I couldn't quite interpret. One of the officers suggested it might have been kids playing a prank, or maybe someone who had the wrong house and left when they realized their mistake. But something in their tone told me they weren't entirely convinced by these explanations. They did a quick walkthrough of the house at my request, checking to make sure no one had managed to get inside. Finding nothing out of order, they advised me to keep the doors and windows locked and to call again if I heard or saw anything suspicious. As I watched their patrol car drive away, I felt a mix of relief and lingering fear. The house suddenly felt too big, too empty. Every shadow seemed to hide potential threats. I double-checked all the locks, then retreated to the guest room where I'd been sleeping. Sleep was impossible. I lay awake, every nerve on high alert, jumping at every little sound. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the curtains, I finally drifted into a restless sleep. The next day, I was a wreck. Lack of sleep, combined with residual fear, left me jittery and unfocused. I couldn't concentrate on my writing, couldn't relax by the pool. I kept replaying the events of the night before in my mind, trying to make sense of what had happened. I decided to do some investigating of my own. I walked around the house, checking for any signs of disturbance, but found nothing. Then I ventured out into the neighborhood, hoping to talk to some of the neighbors. Maybe someone had seen or heard something. The first few houses I tried, no one was home. At the fourth house, an elderly woman answered the door. When I explained what had happened and asked if she'd heard anything, she looked troubled. She hadn't heard anything last night, she said, but a similar incident had occurred a few weeks ago at another house in the neighborhood. This information sent a chill through me. It wasn't an isolated incident. Something was going on in this seemingly peaceful neighborhood. I spent the rest of the day making inquiries, talking to any neighbors who were home. A few had stories similar to mine, late-night knocking, but no one there when they checked. One man said he'd seen a car he didn't recognize driving slowly through the cul-de-sac late at night on several occasions. As evening approached, my anxiety grew. The thought of spending another night in the house alone was terrifying. I called my friend Mike, who lived in Burbank, and asked if I could stay with him for the night. He agreed, sounding concerned when I briefly explained the situation. I packed an overnight bag and left a note for Sarah in case she tried to contact the house while I was gone. As I drove to Mike's place, I felt guilty for abandoning my house-sitting duties, but the relief of not having to spend another night in that house outweighed the guilt. Mike was a great friend. He listened to my story without judgment, offered me a beer, and did his best to distract me with funny stories and bad movies. But even in the safety of his apartment, surrounded by the familiar sounds of the city, I couldn't fully relax. The next day, I returned to Sarah's house, feeling somewhat refreshed but still on edge. I spent the day working on my screenplay, trying to lose myself in the fictional world I was creating. But as night fell, the fear returned. I decided to be proactive. I turned on every light in the house, inside and out. I found an old baseball bat in the garage and kept it close. I even set up my laptop to record the front door, thinking that if anything happened, at least I'd have evidence. The night passed without incident, but I barely slept. The next few days fell into a pattern. Anxious days followed by sleepless nights. I jumped at every sound, constantly checked and rechecked the locks, and spent hours staring at the security footage, looking for anything suspicious. By the time Sarah and her family returned, I was a nervous wreck. I debated whether or not to tell them what had happened. In the end, I decided they had a right to know. Sarah was understandably concerned both for her family's safety and for what I'd gone through. She promised to report the incident to the neighborhood watch and consider installing a security system. As I drove home to my tiny apartment in Koreatown, I felt a mix of emotions. I was relieved to be leaving the house and the fear behind, but I also felt a lingering sense of unease. The incident had shaken my sense of safety, made me acutely aware of how vulnerable we all are, even in the seemingly secure environments. I never house-sat for anyone after that experience. The allure of a big house and a swimming pool no longer outweighed the potential risks in my mind. But I didn't let the fear control my life either. I still enjoy the occasional late-night writing session. Still take walks in my neighborhood after dark. I'm just a little more cautious, a little more aware. Thank you for watching. If you found these stories gripping, don't forget to subscribe for more spine-tingling content. For another hair-raising tale, check out our suggested video. And if you're hungry for more eerie encounters, dive into our playlist featuring similar chilling narratives.